Let's talk about component forces, but I'm going to use this force table here so that we can make these seemingly abstract ideas real and testable by, if we apply weights to here and here and here and they pull at different angles, how much do we need in each one in order to balance this equation? And then what does that mean for in the gym? I think the easiest one that we can compare this to, where we have two forces pulling here and one force pulling there, is something like a rope pushdown, right? And we can play with a few different angles for what we're dealing with. So if this guy here pulls up and down, let's say he's the top of the rope going up on my pushdown. So what I'm going to try and balance out here is 200 grams on the one side, and then figure out if these guys are pulling in this direction, how much does each one have to come up with in order to balance the 200 grams on that side? So how could we think of this? Well, we could divide this up into a graph where this guy is the y, the vertical part of the graph, and across here would be the x, or the horizontal part of the graph. Well, if that's the graph, and this is our 0, straight down the middle here, then this guy pulling straight up towards you guys up through the camera lens only acts in the y direction. It doesn't have anything pulling off to the side, pulling along the x or horizontal axis at all. But these guys, we can see, are pulling off at an angle, and that means some of this force is coming down the y-axis, and some of this force is coming across the x-axis. So what we need to know is how much do both of these guys need to produce to come up with the equal amount of force that this guy produces along the y-axis. So this guy plus this guy must equal this guy in the y direction. But because they're pulling out in that direction, they're going to have to come up with more force because they're not in the same line. They're not as efficient. Some of their force is being spent going out in these x components. To calculate that stuff, we're going to need that trigonometry thing we've touched on. And I didn't think I'd be into Pythagoras either, but it turns out if you can relate it to trying to get jacked, I will pay attention to Pythagoras. So we've got, how much does this come down here with? Well, this is the angle, and we always refer to things from the perspective of the angle. So the cosine is equal to the adjacent, which is the length of this guy next to the angle, divided by the hypotenuse, which is this. So we need to know the cosine. So the cosine is going to give us this force coming down the Fy. And then the sine is going to give us this force running along in this particular direction, because that one is related to the opposite, and the opposite is going to be opposite from the angle. So it's this thing running along here, divided by the hypotenuse. So we're interested in the Fy component, which we know is 100, and we can then use that to calculate how much this is. Because if we take 100 and divide it by the cosine of this angle, we will get this force. So let's test it. So we have 200 grams here, 100 and 100, that we're going to hang on the one side of the force table. Now this starts to pull on this guy. It really wants to go in that direction, so I have to anchor him on here and hope he stays for a second while we put something on here. Now the calculation I did means I think we need 140 pulling on each side of this to counter the 200 pulling in that particular direction. So here is 140, and here is 140. Just hold that while I switch this round. And if that is right, I can take that out and it will hold fast. And that is precisely because the Fy components of this angle are equal to the Fy component in that direction from that resistance. So let's ask a slightly different question. Instead of 45 degrees, what does it give us if we put it at 30 degrees? Okay, so according to my calculations on this, to have 120 on this, I'm actually going to need to have 210 over there. Downside to this is it only comes in hundreds, 50s, 20s and 10s, so actually I can't quite get the exact number needed to balance 200 with things on here at 30, so we've given it a slight tweak. So you can see instead of 200 there, there's this extra little 10 placed on top. But this is now at 30 degrees, so I'm going to hold that while I place 120 and 120 onto the force table. And can I take this out without it moving? Yeah, now I can. Because at 30 degrees, between this angle and here, there is a larger Fy component and a smaller Fx component, which means this, at this angle, is better aligned to fight that than it was when it was at 45 degrees. So when we're doing that tricep pushdown, the further this gets apart, the less effective it becomes for your triceps, in exactly the same way that as this gets further out, it is also less able to fight that. To the point that if we put this at exactly 90 degrees, no amount of force pulling down at 90 degrees could stop that working in that direction. It would need at least a small angle on each side. Now, if it was, 89 degrees on each side, it had a degree, the amount of force it would have to pull with in order to fight that, due to how inefficient its line is, would be massive compared. So as we go from here and get further and further round, we become less and less efficient at fighting that guy. And it's the same in the gym as it is on this force table, because this is just physics, and therefore it applies to everything.